The thrusting sword weapon category is actually pretty decent. I do wish that they actually were expanded upon in the DLC because there actually isn't a single unique skill amongst all of them, and they kind of all feel the exact same as well. But thrusting swords are very quick weapons that do a bunch of poking attacks and obviously do piercing damage, which is really good. And I think their one-handed and two-handed movesets are just a lot better than a lot of the other types of quick weapons like straight swords or curved swords. But typically when you're using these really fast dexterity types weapons, they're going to be better power stanced. Because in most cases, the moveset's going to be like just as fast, but you're just going to be hitting with multiple weapons. So it's going to pair nicely alongside the multi-hit talismans or status effect builds, and it can just output some of the highest DPS in the game. Things like curved swords, straight swords, claws, and even spears offer some of the best power sensing combos in the game. And when using these weapon types, the most optimal path is typically with a power sensing combo. But unfortunately for the thrusting swords, I cannot say that, because the power sensing movesets tend to have longer animations and it doesn't output anywhere near as much DPS as these other weapon types that I mentioned. And the fact that this weapon class also gets some pretty poor stance damage alongside this not having any types of unique skills, like how straight swords get square off or katanas get unsheathed or light great swords get wing stance. They don't really have their own specific skill. So for the most part, I think they're pretty viable and nice, but they're probably my least favorite option out of all the really small and quick types of dexterity weapons. But for today, we are going to rank all 8 of them from worst to best, and don't worry, we're going to cover the heavy thrusting swords tomorrow. So if you are interested in that, definitely do subscribe. But yeah, let's just get into it. Starting off at the bottom, the Frozen Needle, which this weapon is just terrible. It gets the worst damage and the worst range out of all of the thrusting swords. It does scale primarily off dexterity with that B scaling that it does have, but all other thrusting swords with a keen infusion just straight up out damage it. But it does have a couple of things going for it. One, it does have passive frost, but it only gets 60 frost build up. If you were to go with a cold infusion into any other thrusting sword, they're going to get 105 frost. And also it does get a projectile heavy attack, but this projectile heavy attack just sucks because it doesn't do good damage. It only does 8 stance damage, which is like 3 times less than a regular charged heavy attack that the thrusting swords get. It doesn't work with the axe talisman, doesn't work with the two-handed sword talisman, doesn't work with the multi-hit talisman, smithing talisman. It doesn't work with like anything. Like the fact that it is a free projectile heavy attack is still nice, but there are plenty of really cheap projectile options in this game that don't really consume much FP that you could just go with and pair with a thrusting sword, and this is going to be a better weapon because you just get more damage, potentially get more frost build up if you go with a cold infusion. Like this weapon needed to have a hitbox at closer range because it doesn't actually have one, and it needs to actually work with all of these different talismans, get some more frost build up, and it needed to have a unique skill because it gets stuck with impaling thrust, which is still decent, but it's not unique, and this weapon can't be infused. And even then, the heavy attack is still somewhat inconsistent. It doesn't really go that far. A lot of the times it just misses even against like larger bosses if they're like somewhat skinny. Sometimes the projectile can just whiff. When you actually do feint the heavy attack, it does actually turn into a projectile as well. And it is like a bit quicker than like the regular heavy attack. But there's way too many downsides for me to actually want to use this weapon. Number 7, the CARIAN Sorcery Sword, which is the lone new thrusting sword from the DLC, does actually have an intelligence dexterity scaling with some split magic damage, and the total base damage is just terrible. Like every thrusting sword that can be infused can just straight up out damage this with like most different types of infusions, and it doesn't help that this thing only gets stuck with impaling thrust and also cannot be infused as well. But this weapon actually is a weapon catalyst, so it actually does cast some sorceries, which is actually tied to the heavy attack. So inherently you just lose out on a heavy attack and you only really have your light attack combos and your weapon skill to just do damage to the weapon itself. And as a catalyst, it actually is pretty decent. It is actually the highest damaging catalyst at 40 intelligence. But being that you do get this in the DLC, you're more likely than not going to be above 40 intelligence anyway. And at that point, you're better off using things like the CARIAN Regal Scepter or the Lucet Staff, and you're going to get like way higher damage. The thing is with these weapon catalysts across these Souls games, they tend to be very convenient and actually very fun to use because you can use two-hand your weapon, use your light attacks or use your shield, and just be able to just like seamlessly throw out some sorceries as well. So it's very convenient, but it's never optimal. If you actually wanted to use spells, you're always better off going with another staff. And if you wanted some more weapon damage, you're always better off going with another weapon. I kind of wish it was one of the highest damaging in terms of its sorcery scalings. Maybe have like a unique skill that just boosts the spell damage by like 20 seconds and it ends up being like the highest damaging one. Like it's pretty cool and convenient for what it is right now, but I feel like it could have been way cooler. Number 6, the Noble's ESTOC, which this weapon is basically identical to the ESTOC in every single way, which is a great weapon, but that one is just better because you just get more damage and have the exact same moveset. Basically, with every single infusion, the ESTOC just straight up out damages the Noble's ESTOC, and that one is much easier to acquire because the Noble's ESTOC is tied behind a very annoying farm. The only benefit that the Noble's ESTOC does have over the regular ESTOC is that it has a bit more range, but it's such a small difference that you're just never going to notice at all. So you're just always better off going with the ESTOC in just every single instance. It still is a good weapon because it does offer you that nice heavy attack with this horizontal swipe, because typically with thrusting swords you get stuck with just a bunch of poking attacks, and having a horizontal swipe for a heavy is really good. But honestly, the only reason you really want to use this weapon in particular is because you think it looks cool, and that's it. Number 5, the Rapier, which is a thrusting sword that can be infused, and out of all the ones that can be infused, this one has the worst range and the worst damage. So if you did want to go with a build that predominantly used things like weapon skills or just like R1 spamming, or even like status effect builds, you're always just better off going into a different direction. But the Rapier does have some things going for it, and that's one, it is actually the lightest or tied for the lightest thrusting sword in the game, and it does have 130 crit. And crit damage on thrusting swords are already pretty high, so this weapon can just turn into like a nicest critical damaging machine, and actually can be comparable to like the Misericord in terms of damage in some cases. And thrusting swords I'm just going to prefer more as a weapon class over daggers because they're going to get more range, be just as fast, and just do a bit more stance damage. But thrusting swords still do like really poor stance damage to the point where you're almost never going to stance break, so that 130 crit isn't going to be as useful as you'd like, but it is going to pair nicely with a parrying build because it does offer you the option to get critical attacks without having to stance break. But parrying in this game is a lot more situational because a lot of enemies still cannot be parried, a lot of attacks can't be parried, and for some bosses it requires multiple parries just to be able to get a critical attack. So if the only use of this weapon is to pair along parrying builds, and parrying itself is still not that great, and that the Misericord is still going to offer you some more damage with a critical attack type of build, and it also doesn't require much effort to switch back and forth between weapons after getting a parry, I don't really consider the Rapier to be that useful, but I think it serves as a better primary option over the Misericord. Number 4, the ANTSPUR Rapier, which is another thrusting sword that can be infused, does actually tie for the worst range out of the thrusting swords alongside the regular Rapier, does actually offer the exact same moveset as well, which unfortunately is nothing but poking attacks. So if you actually did want to have some variety with like horizontal swipes, you're not going to get that. And its damage is a somewhat average, but most of the other thrusting swords that can be infused are just going to straight up out damage it. But the major benefit is obviously that it comes with passive rot. And Scarlet Rot is really powerful. Once it is procced, it is just going to result in roughly 15 or 16% damage over 90 seconds. And this weapon can be infused, so you can pair it alongside multiple different status effects, and you can put them all together and just make for very fun builds. Now the thing is, this build type is very gimmicky still. It's never going to really be that optimal, and that's for a couple reasons. One, Scarlet Rot doesn't scale with anything, which is really annoying. I kind of wish it did scale with Arcane, so you can pair this with an Occult infusion, and it could make for us a nice build synergy. But unfortunately, that Rot build-up cannot be improved at all unless you put some Rot grease onto it. And it's still going to get the lesser version of Rot, because spell-based Rot versions are just going to get you some more damage. So if you actually did want to pair this with like a bleed type of infusion and go into a bit of Arcane, you're better off just going with like the Rotten Breath spell, or if you had like a bit of faith, using things like Scarlet Ionia, Rotten Butterflies, or even just using the hefty Rot pot. These things are going to do twice as much damage in terms of its Scarlet Rot, at roughly 30% damage over 90 seconds. I don't know why these sources of Rot are just like way more powerful than like the weapon versions, but I think those are the two major reasons that's holding this weapon back a little bit. But it still is a nice way to proc Rot without having to farm for anything or without having to consume any FP. And it still is a nice damaging thrusting sword, and there are a lot of enemies in the game that are wicked to piercing damage and can be procced with Rot pretty quickly. Like promised Consort Radahn, this is a very popular weapon to counteract him. But unfortunately for most other weapons in the game, there are going to be much better optimal status effect builds out there. Number 3, the ROGIER'S Rapier, which I consider to be one of the more underrated thrusting swords in this game. It's actually so close to being like the best thrusting sword and like an S tier option, but it's just lacking one thing in particular, and that's typically what thrusting swords lack in particular, and that's stance damage. This is a regular thrusting sword that can be infused, gets average damage, average range, but it does have a unique heavy attack in this nice double poke, and this double poke is just going to outdamage all the other heavy attacks that the thrusting swords get, and being that it's a quick double poke, it's going to proc status effects quickly, it's going to work with the multi-hit talismans nicely. Like if I'm using this weapon, I'm just using uncharged heavy attacks or just fully charged heavy attacks the entire time. Like I'm rarely ever using the light attacks with a weapon like this, because you're going to actually output more damage and actually do more stance damage. And if you end up proccing a stance break, this thing actually gets 110 crit. So you actually can get a lot of damage with a riposte with this weapon too. Now, as I mentioned, with thrusting swords, they get pretty poor stance damage. They only get 24 stance damage with a two-handed charged heavy attack, which is really bad. Things like straight swords or curved swords get 33 stance damage with a charged heavy. If this thing had at least that much, it would easily be an S tier option, because it would just be stance breaking a lot faster, especially if you had Cragblade onto it, and it could make for one of the better charged heavy attack builds in the game. So we're really close to having an S tier weapon, but it just couldn't get there in my opinion. Number 2, the CLEANROT's Night Sword, which is an infusible thrusting sword that does actually offer the most amount of range and actually the highest base damage out of all the thrusting swords. So going with a lot of different types of infusions, this one can just literally get the highest amount of damage. Except for a dexterity build at higher levels, the ESTOC is just going to get more damage, and it's going to be the most popular pairing. So if you wanted to go with a dex build, that one is going to be a bit better. Now, I think the most unfortunate part about the weapon is that it just gets nothing but poking attacks. There is like no horizontal swipes at all. Even the heavy attack is just like a regular poke, which piercing damage and poking attacks are really good, But if that's the only move that you have, it's going to be pretty hard to hit certain types of enemies. Some enemies that are really skinny or hard to lock onto, or that are really mobile, using poking attacks might not be the most optimal method, and you want to have some more moveset variety. But if that isn't really a big deal for you, then I just recommend going with the CLEANROT Night Sword. It's probably the best one. But at number 1, I am going to go with ESTOC, the best stock. In my opinion, this one is just the most solid and reliable thrusting sword for PvE. It does get some of the most range. It actually does get the highest amount of damage with a dexterity build. The ESTOC just outdamages the rest. Now, once again, if you wanted to go with elemental types of builds, the CLEANROT Night Sword is better for you. But the main reason I value the ESTOC is because its heavy attack is a nice horizontal swipe, and that's for both different heavy attacks. And when you're going through the game, there's always so many circumstances to where you wish you just had horizontal swipes. Because you might get ganked by a bunch of like smaller trash mobs, or you're fighting these like really skinny enemies, and you want to have like a horizontal swipe just to hit them. Then I think the ESTOC is just going to be your best thrusting sword for that. It's not going to get as much damage as like the regular thrusting sword heavy attack, but I'd rather take a little bit of trade-off in damage just to just have some more variety with the moveset. Now, if you were going to use like a weapon skill that already got some nice crowd control, whether it be like an AoE skill or things like spinning slash, then using the ESTOC is probably not the most necessary thing. But if you did want to actually use a thrusting sword build for whatever reason, I recommend going with the ESTOC. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. As I mentioned, we're going to go cover the heavy thrusting swords tomorrow, which there is not that many. There's only like 6. So actually will be another shorter type of video. And then after that, we'll go cover the curved swords. So if that does interest you, please do like and subscribe. And also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there every day doing a bunch of challenge runs. But yeah, I'll catch you guys later. Bye.